This is Chapter 7 of Unfuck the Poor, titled, Get This, America's Haunted Whorehouse. For any of this chapter to make sense, you have to believe in ghosts and their carnal thirst in the afterlife. Okay, in reality, this chapter explains why America's currency is top of the heap, top banana, if you will, in all foreign transactions, and why what you read, what you see, what you hear on the news might not be completely forthright. Does it venture into the realm of conspiracy? Well, I certainly don't think so. These things are well documented, but if they make you feel kind of gross like a bad conspiracy theory would, rest assured it's because they are real life gross, the kind of gross that makes you look at Fox News and NPR like, I don't think I trust either of you. For more about this episode, as always, visit askaleftist.com. And you know what? Let's ask a special guest what he thinks about the gold standard.
It is a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage, where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
Unfuck the Poor, Chapter 7, America's Haunted Whorehouse. Under normal circumstances, I would never, ever begin a chapter by reading a footnote, but this is not a normal circumstance. Normally, I would leave it to you to look up this primary reference on your own, but this deserves special attention. The exhaustive research by Lawrence Shoup in his doctoral dissertation, Shaping the National Interest, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Department of State, and the Origins of the Post-War World, 1939 to 1943, what a long title, served as a great reference for this chapter. Shoup has been credited for direct citations, but Shoup should take the bulk of the credit for information in this section. I simply don't have the resources to pour through National Archives, though many of his sources provided an excellent jumping-off point. U.S. history is best studied when you find something interesting. The bullshit you read in, quote, social studies is basically farce. And the requirements to remember dates is, well, it's like this. You don't remember dates by hammering them into students' heads. You read a book, an article, you watch a documentary, and guess what? You pretty much remember the goddamn dates for the rest of your life because then it's a thing you know. My recall isn't the best. I get dates confused all the time, but this is real life and Google is a thing and no one gives a fuck. What? Shoup. I'm going to send him an email. America's Haunted Whorehouse. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire is a nothing town of exquisite beauty and unique geography, making it a top-tier ski resort in an unlikely location. Source: me. I have been to New Hampshire. According to its Wikipedia entry, it has 3 or 4 buildings, one of which is the Washington Hotel, which is a 25,000 square foot spa where ghosts give cold spot hand jobs. Allegedly. By me. The Washington Hotel was completed in 1902 by a Pennsylvania coal broker. It was in private hands for a while, then became a commercial venture, most recently purchased by Omni Hotels in 2015. It was featured on Ghost Hunters, an advertising product disguised as a TV show to promote travel, Season 4, Episode 7, in 2008. The Ghost Hunters found cold spots in the hotel, evidence of paranormal activity rather than, inadequate insulation. I can only assume that the cold spots lure guests into secret areas to warm them up with hand jobs. It's the only logical assumption one can make when discussing ghosts. Anyway, the 44 Allied nations met at the Washington Hotel in 1944 to discuss the post-war economy. I think it's common for history to teach this moment as one of unity and security, but it is not just a moment in history. It is the culmination of private planning that started immediately after World War I. Part of entering war, if you're doing it in a conscious fashion, is the establishment of a post-war plan. I mean, you don't just go into war without a plan. Now, post-World War II, this would simply become not true. Every U.S. military conflict afterward would basically be equal to pressing a button and wondering what would happen. Immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, American planners decided without dissent that America would be the top world power after the war, and that isn't speculation. General George V. Strong, head of the War Department's Military Intelligence and member of the Advisory Subcommittee on Post-War Foreign Policy, was quite clear on the path forward, declaring that the U.S., quote, must cultivate a mental view toward world settlement after this war which will enable us to impose our own terms, amounting perhaps to a Pax Americana, end quote. The view of Isaiah Bowman, chairman of the Territorial Subcommittee, was more evildoery, describing America's security position as, quote, strategically necessary for world control. And in a post-war world that was sure to struggle with ongoing conflict, after all, when a war is over, it's not like everyone forgets that those assholes over there had just been dropping bombs, and economic recovery, The solution for these simmering conflicts was the establishment of the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which would handle global economic concerns. Mind you, these ideas are not being bounced off international leaders. It's not like FDR was phoning Churchill asking how the war was doing and seeing if he'd be interested in joining a money club. These ideas were being hatched in isolation. The United States built an agenda that, in their thinking, solved two interlinked problems. International peace would foster economic growth for all. What remains unsaid, so I will say it, is that FDR, or at least the enormous think tank behind all of this planning, must have had colossal balls to plot world control immediately upon entering a war that it had, prior to December 7, 1941, absolutely no interest in joining. If you think the testicle comment is juvenile, I agree. The thinking and the strategy is full-on hubris. You could call it a best-case scenario kind of plan, one that requires the right window of opportunity to implement. These plans and these proposed institutions, this multilateral control over world economics by a single nation, would only be possible in the event of unconditional surrender by Germany and Japan. They would have to accept the victor's conditions of surrender, which would be backed up by allied powers, Great Britain included, second banana to America. Cheers. These powers would meet at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in the Presidential Hotel, deliberate for 3 weeks, and sign the Bretton Woods Agreement, which first and foremost established gold and the US dollar as the foundation of international money games. Here's how this works. Similar to the Fed, which acts as the decentralized central bank of the US, the International Monetary Fund was designed as a decentralized central international bank, basically the nanny of international loans to make sure countries were paying their debts on time. And the U.S. retained sole veto power over IMF rules. Recall, if you will, the idea of preemption. This, of course, was the United States' goal from inception. An international bank backed solely by gold, the U.S. held most of the world's gold at the time, and the U.S. dollar set up the United States to be the primary beneficiary of the global economy. Great Britain was miffed, but there wasn't much they could do about it. The prediction that Britain wouldn't return to the world stage as powerful as it was before the war was realized by the Bretton Woods Agreement. Up to this point, we have not discussed any economist in depth because they are frankly not worth the effort. However, the Bretton Woods money game system was opposed by perhaps the only human economist at the time, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was handed a preliminary draft of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1942 and had some reservations. The name of the United States proposed bank was misleading, International Monetary Fund. Keynes, perhaps because he spoke a version of English that made sense, recognized in the convoluted language of the American document, abstracted economic jargon, if you will, that this was no fund after all, but buried within the jargon were stipulations that would completely alter Britain's trade system. An international monetary fund, if you were to take the words at face value, would be a pool of money gathered from member nations to promote economic growth or provide support among members. And this is what Keynes proposed or expected due to the meaning of words, not sure. But he was shot down. Of course, you cannot have an economy without trade, and England was, indeed, in a poor position. All their money had gone to doing war, and their economy was sputtering, and the war, mind you, was still blasting away in 1942. But all these allies were hidden away on Ghost Fuck Mountain, hammering out the particulars of, what was it? Oh yes, world control. Isaiah Bowman's words. But the American proposal was built on the idea of creating the, quote, grand area, turning most parts of the world into one economic area. The problem was Great Britain. You remember how the British Empire was so fucking big that, well, it's like this. If you go to a Japanese restaurant run by Japanese owners, they will likely have some kind of curry on the menu. This was the case at a restaurant my wife worked at. I asked the owner's daughter why they offered curry, and her response was, I think probably something to do with British imperialism and bringing curry from India. Well, that's how far of a reach the British Empire had. At a tiny sushi restaurant in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, the Japanese owners still provided a dish that was the result of a British crosslink between two nations that Great Britain had been sailing to since the goddamn 1500s. So they kind of had their own international trade thing going on called the British Imperial Preference System. It was officialized in 1932, but they had been doing this for a while. Now, British Imperial Preference is a system of trading within the British Empire that, and I have had to read more papers on this than I ever wanted just to distill it to this, lowered the cost of buying and selling shit within the British Empire and made it quite expensive to buy and sell shit outside the British Empire. If you were a colony or dominion of the empire, then you were to give import-export preference to other colonies, dominions, as well as Mother England. Do you want to guess who benefited most from this arrangement? If you've been paying attention, you know the answer cannot possibly be the colonies. The rule was home producers first, England, empire producers second, colonies and dominions, and fuck everyone else third. This is called free trade in some circles. Okay, so Keynes sees this provision in Article 7 of the Bretton Woods Agreement and is like, okay, bro, if I'm reading this correctly, this does away with imperial preference. Is that right? And America was like, yeah, you read that right. Like it was no big thing. Keynes would go on to say, and I'm making this up, we were fucked either way, so I scribbled a thing in the margins and signed it. Keynes didn't exactly just roll over like that. He offered some workarounds, pointing out that the bulk of Britain's money had gone to doing war and that much of its shipping vessels had been kablooied in the war, so trade was going to be expensive, and Keynes offered a revised preferential policy, but America was like, fuck off, and in the end, Britain did indeed fuck off. I do want to add Keynes's theory of the economist here so you know who we're dealing with. And to add to this, Keynes wrote this in an obituary for fellow economist Alfred Marshall. The obituary in full was published in the September 1924 issue of the Economic Journal. The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must be mathematician, historian, statesman, philosopher in some degree. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in the light of the general, and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in the light of the past for the purposes of the future. No part of man's nature or institutions must lie entirely outside his regard. End quote. So Keynes, with his intricate understanding of functional economics, reads Article 7 of the Bretton Woods Agreement, realizes British imperial preference is in jeopardy, and seeing no way around it, writes, and I'm making this up again, as long as it doesn't fuck with our pre-existing trade agreements, in the margins, and then signs it. And just like that, global economic power was ready to be transferred from the previous heavyweight title holder to its own bastard child. At this point, you might be wondering what in the absolute fuck any of this has to do with Air Force Ones. Well, a considerably great fuckload of a lot, actually. So I want you to put yourself in a situation where you're looking at this whole thing and saying, okay, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7, and immediately after, the U.S. is like, okay, time to become the supreme world ruler of currency, and starts drafting documents, and then within 3 years, we rule the world. That doesn't exactly add up. After all, an attack on a U.S. base in the Pacific is not exactly a natural segue into global economic dominance, is it? It is not. Now we have to go even further back in time because apparently this is becoming a fucking history book. But I will do this in a way that both entertains and excites, as well as makes things quite simple for me, for I am lazy. It's time for everyone's favorite Unfuck the Poor quiz show, Off the Top of Your Head. Off the top of your head, if you heard of something called the Council on Foreign Relations, would you think it was A, department of government, B, a cabal of blood-drinking child sex traffickers, C, a special interest group of businesses and banks, or D, a thing I made up? If you guess C, then fucking hooray. If you guess the other things, I don't blame you. It's an ambiguous name for a thing, which means it's either boring government stuff, a cover name for nefarious purposes, or that I'm fucking with you again. But business people are also the most boring people on the planet, and they also choose names, and this one is dull. The Council on Foreign Relations has a long history that I cannot possibly explain in unboring terms, so let me begin. This council had two members, Great Britain and the US. They had two branches, New York and London, and they were led by miscellaneous authors, newspaper editors and journalists, former government people, and a parent fuck ton of historians from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Columbia, lawyers, bankers, and Herbert Hoover. That Hoover, but in a different capacity. You see, Hoover was a financier of mining operations and was astute at restructuring failing mines and making a shitload of U.S. dollars. So, the Council on Foreign Relations, officially founded in 1921, grew into the present-day Council on Foreign Relations. Angelina Jolie is a member, so there's that. They host podcasts and an explainer section that puts an interesting spin on international policy. What I'm trying to say is, if you like propaganda, Explainers is great. I'll go into that in a minute. But as I always say, if you want to learn the innermost workings of an organization, just read the first thing they put up on their website. The modern CFR, quote, is an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, and publisher dedicated to being a resource for its members, government officials, business executives, journalists, educators and students, civic and religious leaders, and other interested citizens in order to help them better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. Founded in 1921, CFR takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. Our goal is to start a conversation in this country about the need for Americans to better understand the world. End quote. In other words, who the fuck knows what they're really about? Because that's not really an explanation, that's not really a definition, that's not really even a description. So to give you an idea of exactly what kind of content they produce, let me go in depth on their explainers section. Take, for example, this excerpt from their explainers section on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Quote, Israel views some Palestinian militant groups as existential threats, particularly Hamas, the Islamist organization that governs Gaza and has vowed to destroy Israel. Its suicide bombings and rocket attacks usually target Israeli citizens. End quote. This statement in itself should be a war crime. The designation of Hamas as an Islamist organization is about on par with calling the Republican Party a Christian organization, and that phrase, governs Gaza, is equally misleading. Hamas is the democratically elected party of the Palestinian parliament. It governs Gaza the way, say, Republicans governed the U.S. under Trump, in the lead role, but not by any means the sole purveyor of beliefs and mandates. But Hamas has also, and this is significant, regularly made clear that it indeed wants a two-state solution as backed by basically the rest of the world. The U.S. and Israel have refused this solution for nearly half a century. It's a false explanation by, apparently, a nonpartisan international think tank that wants to help Americans understand the world, and that might be true as long as we understand it the way they tell it. The last thing I'll say on this is the mention of suicide bombings and civilian casualties, rather civilian targets. Hamas is blamed for everything that happens within Gaza's borders. Doesn't matter if it's an unrelated group or lone actor. If it happens, it's Hamas. Civilian deaths at the hands of the Israelis regularly reach the thousands. Israel targets schools and hospitals in retaliation for any perceived threat, with the U.S. turning a blind eye. I'd like for you to turn your attention back to the States, where we are incredibly keen on distinguishing bad actors as separate from entire groups. Take, for instance, the Proud Boys, renounced by most Republicans, and Antifa, renounced by most Democrats. To assume a uniform ideology in any concentration of humans is absurd, and to willingly believe that the millions of Palestinians living in war zone conditions are all Hamas or agents of Hamas is infantile. Back to the Council on Foreign Relations, some of the early members of the CFR and their claims to fame are as follows. Herbert H. Lehman, partner at Lehman Brothers. W. Averill Harriman, one of the founders of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, a bank still around with very high annual revenue. John Foster Dulles, an international lawyer and future Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and, fun fact zone, instigator of coups against democratically elected governments. I am coming back for this asshole. Alan Dulles, brother of John Foster, also a lawyer and future CIA director responsible for the MK-Ultra mind control program, which utilized LSD and psychological torture to solicit, quote, truth from prisoners. Fun fact zone, Ted Kaczynski was one of the torture subjects while a student at Harvard, participating in the program for 3 years. Most rational people believe this had a profound effect on Kaczynski, while Kaczynski maintains that the program never got to him. But mind you, he mailed bombs to people, so who's to say? Alan Dulles was also responsible for the Bay of Pigs fiasco and a couple of other things that I'll get into in a bit. But anyway, he is also an asshole for whom I shall return. And these are only 4 of the original members of the CFR. The list is hundreds long, and they all share the same backgrounds as previously mentioned. They had been working as a think tank, holding regular meetings and dinners to discuss important things in general and pertinent things in particular. And they did this regularly throughout the 1920s and 30s. Many members were men of great wealth. White men of great wealth. The CFR's self-congratulatory autobiographical history titled Continuing the Inquiry mentions that whiteness as a rule happened to be a coincidence, not intentional, while maleness was indeed mandatory. Quote, a prominent African American would surely have been considered with interest. Not on the agenda, however, was membership for women. The prospect of a woman qualified for the council's fellowship was simply too remote from the experience of the founding members even to be raised. End quote. So the implication for the 21st century, reading about the history of the CFR in the 20th century, is that racism could never have been a founding principle, while sexism was a given. This also completely ignores the fact that while the CFR was in its infancy and based in New York, Harlem was culturally and historically a place full of prominent black Americans. Duke Ellington, for example, was based in Harlem and played the Cotton Club, the most popular nightclub, and of course, whites only. W.E.B. Du Bois, George Washington Carver, Harry Pace, Ida B. Wells, James Weldon Johnson all surely meet the criteria for prominent and interesting black Americans with ties to New York. The Cotton Club alone was headlined by the most prominent of black entertainers: Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Cab Calloway, Bessie Smith, the Dandridge Sisters, Billie Holiday, Jimmy Lunsford, and on. But they were not considered prominent. They were considered novelties. The Cotton Club, if you can't tell by the name, was a racist kind of place. Per Harlem World magazine, quote, it reproduced the racist imagery of the era, often depicting black people as savages in exotic jungles or as darkies in the plantation South. The club imposed a subtler color line on the chorus girls, whom the club presented in skimpy outfits. They were expected to be tall, tan, and terrific, which meant they had to be at least 5'6", tall, light-skinned, and under 21 years of age. End quote. While not directly linked to the Cotton Club, the CFR's claim of open admissions within the city of New York is revisionist propaganda, but sure, let's take them at their word, why not? So from 1921 and into the 1930s, the CFR grew into a who's who of New York's white male high society, literally, with many members appearing in the New York Social Register, a publication that lists the city's most prominent citizens, as well as being members of the Century Association, a private social, arts, and dining club that still exists today. Members were well-educated, well-off, and well-connected, though some more than others. John W. Davis, for example, CFR member from 1921 to 46, held an estate worth $1.8 million at the time of his death, approximately $24 million in 2021, while Edwin Gay, active from 21 to 45, had an estimated worth of just about $11,000 upon his death, or equivalent to $140,000 in 2021. On the whole, they represented America's ruling class, the modern aristocracy, if you will, as members of the banking, industrial, media, and political institutions. The reason for the CFR's existence was a direct result of the global turmoil post-World War I. There was little in the way of post-war planning, and the CFR was a direct response to the uncertain post-war economy. Their mission was to keep an eye on, well, shit, it says so right in the name, Council on Foreign Affairs. Keep an eye on what was going on in the world and plan, prepare, and pounce. American secretaries of state would speak at CFR meetings regularly. Members were closely affiliated with policymakers, and many went on to be policymakers or to advise them. At the onset of World War II, the CFR set up special committees or bodies or task forces specific to understanding the economic impact of doing war. The War and Peace study groups were specifically tasked with aiding the U.S. State Department in planning how the world would work after World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the ties between CFR and the State Department became closer, and by December 12th, Hamilton Fish Armstrong, son of colonial settlers and American politicians, or the aristocracy, informed the members of CFR's War and Peace troops that, quote, with the approval of Mr. Norman Davis, I went to Washington and had a talk yesterday morning with Sumner Welles, Undersecretary of State. He expressed generous appreciation of the work which our groups have done so far and said that it must continue at all costs. He agreed that in the circumstances, a more intimate liaison between the department and our project was desirable, and he expressed the hope that he would be able to work out the terms of this liaison within the coming week. End quote. Norman Davis, the gentleman mentioned in Armstrong's memo, is the most consequential CFR member of this period and of the post-war efforts. He dropped out of Vanderbilt and Stanford and moved to Cuba where, as you do, he started an investment banking firm in 1902. His business dealings in Cuba were dubious, and he was found guilty of stock fraud in 1913 and lost an appeal in the Supreme Court. But nonetheless, he returned from Cuba very wealthy. He worked for the U.S. government, specifically on behalf of war doings, serving as financial advisor to Woodrow Wilson, racist, and eventually became Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in charge of foreign loans. Norman Davis believed in the power of the dollar, both abstract and real. He believed the dollar drove both people and nations in all they do. The human and the state, while not the same, behaved the same economically, and therefore the well-being of one equaled the well-being of the other. This is the underlying philosophy of, quote, free trade. If money policy hurts the individual, it hurts the state. Therefore, the individual and the corporation, or if you'll allow, the corporate person, should be allowed to fuck with both money and trade freely, and the state must support, if not enforce, that freedom. And with that, John Maynard Keynes came to receive a draft of the new economic order and saw that the U.S. had enemies not only in Japan and Germany, but in Great Britain as well. The U.S. conferred strength in the European theater, providing significant military aid to Britain, though arguably it was Russia that turned the tide. The U.S. demonstrated its "we will fuck you up" bombing capabilities in Japan, and the Council on Foreign Relations, seeing its window of opportunity, demonstrated its "what the fuck you gonna do" economic warfare on Great Britain. Consider from Keynes' perspective the unfucking believable situation whereby the world's two most aggressive expansionist nations, Japan and Germany, had been beaten and subject to unconditional surrender, while Britain, through its win, had ultimately lost its empire. As part of the CFR's planning strategy, it did what most think tanks and smart people do. It came up with all the possible war outcomes. What if Germany won and Japan was defeated, or vice versa? What if both won? What if Britain won? For its part, the CFR considered this solely in terms of trade. What global outcome would be best for America in terms of economics? Japan would control much of Asia. Germany would control much of Europe and have sympathies in South America. They would effectively cock-block U.S. trade and increase the cost of imports and likely not buy much of United States exports. The only acceptable outcome was British victory, which meant U.S. victory, which meant the U.S. dollar achieving God mode and overall economic freedom for the United States, engineered by the Americans who stood to gain the most from such economic freedom. And you know what? It was a grand success, and you thought America's involvement in World War II was about preserving democracy. It was about establishing global power through economic warfare. Economic warfare is basically economic strategies imposed by one state to weaken the economy of another state. See also economic seppuku, the practice of slicing open one's own belly by imposing economic policies not understood by leadership. See Donald Trump. But of course, there are many other interpretations of doing war. Perhaps the most well understood is that of strategy, meaning the day-to-day realities of war, determining how a war plays out move by move, and the unique situations military leaders must adapt to. This is viewed as real-world chess, where players must outmaneuver each other and see multiple steps ahead, and considering the multiple fronts of World War II, this is no less an incredible feat and makes for a rich field of study, how a war plays out militarily and diplomatically. But it is also important to mention here that no matter the outcome of any of the war scenarios, the CFR worked relentlessly to establish playbooks that would best position the U.S. economy after the war. And this, for what it's worth, is mere pragmatism. The distinction is whose interests are served by pragmatism, and in the case of the CFR, its interests were those of its members, the wealthy and elite, who saw grim economic prospects or diminished wealth if the U.S. did not come out on top. It can hardly be said that they acted in the interests of American humans. Their actions benefited a unique group of American persons, corporations. But believe it or not, we're still not done with the CFR because they ran through a lot of scenarios. Perhaps the most interesting is their fear of the actual spread of democracy, which echoes the fears colonial Americans had about allowing the commoners to pick their leaders and rule amongst themselves. The planning of the Council on Foreign Relations is eerily similar to the thoughts expressed by Madison, Morris the Asshole, and other members of the new American aristocracy in the time of Revolution. The CFR's post-war planning had to account for and prevent against the possibility of revolution at home and abroad, because they were afraid that socialism, the belief in and pursuit of the common good, would alter the trajectory of international trade and governance. That is, it threatened the individual pursuit of wealth. The Bretton Woods Agreement, signed in 1944, set in place all the economic and foreign policy necessary to curtail free reign of authentic democracy and impose a unique brand of American democracy, capital imperialism. That is to say, economic freedom or private corporations unfettered by social accountability. This was Chapter 7 of Unfuck the Poor, America's Haunted Whorehouse. For more about the Council on Foreign Relations, I definitely recommend reading the in-depth dissertation written by Lawrence Shoup, available by following the link at askaleftist.com, because, and this can't be understated, it is way more compelling a conspiracy theory than aliens or the moon landing. I mean, shit, they were just writing and talking about all out in the open. It's basically not even a conspiracy, it's basically just fact. Anyway, if you like tropical fruit and pointless murder, you'll love Chapter 8, Murder for Bananas, because I bet you are left wondering, okay, well, how on earth does the US winning World War II turn out bad for anyone? Anyway, I hope you really like bananas.